It's very difficult, I should add, to find among professional political philosophers and theorists people who would describe themselves as opposed to democracy, although there are people who have that view. Where the action is, of course, is in trying to understand what it is one is advocating.
Is there a nation outside of the U.S. that you think handles democracy better than us?
In 2010, by the way, the country went through this amazing process of revising its constitution that I'll describe for you in a minute. It wound up being undermined at the very end. So this is like a story of like real commitment to democracy that winds up sort of falling apart at the very end. Because democracy's hard. In 2010, the country of Iceland sought to revise its constitution. And the way it did it was by way of a series, very elaborate processes of consulting all of the citizens, everyone in the world with Icelandic citizenship, not merely the Icelanders who lived in Iceland. Part of that process involved putting up on a wiki the current Icelandic constitution and giving citizens access to edit it.
All right, so this is another one of our very special guests that Nishant went out on a limb and just tried to reach out to and kept getting declined until we finally got a response from someone oh so special. That's what it seems to be the trend. These guys these folks rather that we feel like are untouchable or unreachable, those are the ones that respond to us. And this is yet another one. So Dr. Robert Talisse, author, like philosopher, what else? There's so many other words we can give for you, and we're going to learn so much more now in this conversation. But thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and where are you joining us from exactly? Which
Nashville, Tennessee.
Oh wow! Okay, so we're both in the Midwest right now. That's great. That's great.
Well, depending. Some people think that Nashville is the middle of Tennessee, but still the South. But anyway.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, no, that's so great. Nishant, now tell us how did you find Dr. Talisse? Can you?
I just wanted to I'm a big philosopher, or I enjoy listening to philosophical conversations, right? So I was like, okay, I want some of the top philosophers, especially professors from the United States, from the colleges. So I just started reaching out to people, and he was kind enough to accept the invitation. So, whatever, I'm just open to learn anything, right, at this point. So,
and we've seen you've been on quite a few podcast appearances, more so audio, right? I think, is this one of the very few video podcasts that you've been on?
Well, I've done a bunch of things, but yeah, I guess mostly just sort of strictly speaking podcasts, which tend to be audio, but
right.
I've done video things too, but yeah, I do a lot of these. I say yes to whatever I can. So if anybody is out there listening or watching, I'm happy to talk to almost anybody.
That's awesome. That's such a treat. You're sharing your gift with the world, and that's wonderful. Now, you have your own Wikipedia page, so that helped. As we're doing our research, that was pretty neat to see that not everyone has their own Wikipedia page. That's something that I feel like anyone would want to aspire to kind of get. I feel like a Google profile listing when you type their name and then a Wikipedia page. I feel like those are the two stamps of I left my digital footprint in the world. So
yeah, I only recently learned about the Wikipedia page because. Until recently, the first sentence of whatever it says about me on that page, somebody had sent it to me. The first sentence said, Robert Talisse is an American-born political philosopher. The first sentence includes that I'm left-handed. It's Robert Talisse is a left-handed American-born. I thought that was a weird detail. So I put out on Twitter, I said, if anybody is a Wikipedia person, I think it's kind of weird that it mentions that I'm left-handed. Apparently, could somebody edit that out? And then, within 48 hours, the left-handed thing was gone. And
wow.
I suppose I should review it for other weird details, but yeah, the left-handed thing was a very strange thing that somebody saw fit to include.
If people are keeping updates, then maybe you can just add in extra details of people should just to flex. By the way, you missed this award.
So we're assuming you're right-handed then.
No, I am left-handed. It's just a strange. I'm left-handed. It was just a strange, just a strange detail. Like American-born, okay. Political philosopher, okay. Nashville, Tennessee, Vanderbilt University, all that's fine. But to say left-handed just looked to me like a strange detail. That I don't know what the person who decided that was worth adding. It doesn't say I had brown eyes. And left-handed, didn't give my height. 5'4". Just left-handed was just strange.
Wow,
so I think, by the way, I think it's gone. But maybe as I understand how Wikipedia works, somebody could have just added it. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe
it's gone. It seems like.
Okay, unless there's some reason why that's an important feature of that should be included in the page that I'm not aware of. Somebody should let me know why that matters.
We need to have they need to have like a fun fact, like a version of Wikipedia that's just like not to say obscure facts, but just I guess eye colors and what whether they're right-handed, left-handed, or ambidextrous. So that would certainly be something to include there. But
my first question, what's your opinion about democracy? How do you look at it?
Okay, that's a very capacious question. It's a good question.
I was like, that's a loaded one. That's like right out the gate, man.
Which is good. So I am a supporter, defender, advocate of democracy.
Okay.
I don't think that that's a uncommon position for people in my line of work. It's very difficult, I should add, to find among professional political philosophers and theorists people who would describe themselves as opposed to democracy, although there are people who have that view. Where the action is, of course, is in trying to understand what it is one is advocating when one says one is an advocate for democracy, or what is it that one supports when one says that one is a supporter of democracy. And so there are lots of different ways of thinking about what democracy is, and indexed to each of those different ways of thinking about what democracy is, there are different accounts about why we should support it or defend it or advocate for it. Naturally, if there's a disagreement over, what a term like democracy means, there's going to be a lot of disagreement over what it means to support it or defend it or advocate for it, or be committed to it. And so, part of what I do professionally, as a political philosopher, is try to propose and defend a certain conception of what democracy, the term, picks out, like what it means. And then from there, talk about why democracy understood in that way is good, or is choice-worthy, or is worth supporting. So first thing then to say is that, when we think of democracy and sort of when the sort of ordinary person on the street is asked about democracy, particularly asked what democracy is, it's very natural for us to start thinking about certain kinds of institutions like elections,
Hmm.
like regular elections, like regular elections with multiple candidates, like regular elections with multiple candidates where each citizen of an adult age gets a single vote. Sometimes we also might think of, in addition to elections, we might think of constitutions, right? A democracy has a constitution, right? A publicly viewable, publicly scrutinizable sort of list of, like, how the government's supposed to work and what people's duties are, and how the powers are separated. Um, we might also think of the actual institutions by which government gets done. So, two houses, the House of Representatives, the Senate, the President, the judiciary. We might think of institutions in a more abstract sense, like the rights that are recognized by the government, that accrue to the individuals, right, to the people. First Amendment rights, Fifth Amendment rights. We might think of all of these sort of more institutional aspects of democracy and say, well, democracy is a kind of government where office holders are chosen by regular elections, where there are multiple candidates, and each adult citizen has an equal say in who gets elected. We might tell that kind of story. I don't think that's the right kind of story, though. Although I think it's true, right? Democracies are, well, let me put it this way. It's true that there are certain kinds of institutions that are characteristic of democracy, and elections, constitutions, and sort of representative government are sort of the three major kinds of institutions that are present where there's democracy. I think it's also very, very difficult to explain why elections, for example, are so important for democracy, or why the separation of powers and the rule of law is so important, so central to democracy, unless we think of democracy in slightly different terms. It's not just the institutions. Democracy is really the kind of society that those characteristic institutions are meant to realize. Does that make sense? So what a democracy is a kind of society. Characteristic of that society is a certain form of government. Characteristic of that government are certain kinds of institutions and practices and norms. But democracy itself, I think, is best understood as the aspiration. So I've added a new thing. It's the aspiration to create a kind of society, a certain kind of society. What kind of society? Here's the takeaway, right? So democracy is the aspiration to build a society of self-governing equals. Now, when you see democracy as that kind of aspiration, it seems to me, and we could get into details if you want, but maybe we want to sort of keep, not get mired in this kind of sort of granular minutia, right? When you see democracy as the aspiration to build a society of self-governing equals, then you can start seeing why it's so central that there are elections, and that there's, well, one person, one vote, and that there's that there are separations of powers, that there's a public constitution. All of these institutional forms with which we associate democracy really are instruments for helping to build a society that aspires to, works towards, tries to protect or pursue the ideal of being a self-governing society of equals. Does that make sense?
Hey, Nishant, have you heard about iCover Direct?
No, what's that?
Of course you have, you silly. We work for the company. If you want life insurance in as quick as 5 minutes with no agents, no medical exams. Check out iCoverDirect.com. That's iCoverDirect.com and go through the application process just to see what your quote looks like, what your monthly premium looks like. It doesn't take long at all, truly. I mean, the amount of times that I've gone through it just to, see what it looks like, to remind myself, or literally to remind myself how wonderful and quick the process is. I do it. I've done it so many times, and it's so simple, so quick, so easy. I still have a hard time believing it to this day. It doesn't have to be hard. You don't need anybody's help, but if you do need help, you could reach out to us via the phone number that you'll see in the application process, or via email, or literally just reach out to Nishant and I, however which way, whether it's email, LinkedIn, find our personal socials. It's not that hard. And yeah, Nishant?
And trust me, it's 2026. Getting a life insurance policy for your family is the best gift you can give them this year. So trust me, you don't even have to leave your house. All you need is your mobile phone or your computer, right? Go to iCoverDirect.com. No medical exams, no documents. You can ignore everything, right? All you have to do is answer a few personal questions, a few medical questions, and that's it. That's it. In less than 5 minutes, you can secure your family.
Yes, it does.
Hmm.
But Nishant, if you like, by all means, if there's, I know, because this is something that you and me both last night were discussing, and so if there's anything that you or I need to ask, we'll certainly ask it, because I think this is something you mentioned, getting into the minutia. This is something that we feel like not many people could get into the minutia of, right?
That's
So,
great. Yeah.
so we'll everything you've laid down now does make sense as far as how you broke it down. But Nishant, if you have another question, we could ask him that, or we could get into the mind, like more.
I have a
further.
lot of questions.
Yeah.
Bring it on.
Okay, so it's not related to democracy. So how do you perceive, or how do you look at dictatorship or communism?
Well, okay, so I'm opposed to both.
Yeah, of course.
Mainly because,
Mhm.
and I'll just say something sort of even more general. I think that only democratic societies can be legitimate. I think that part of the way that I think democracy is justified, but only part of one way in which democracy is justified. I think there are all kinds of other grounds on which we can talk about the merits and value of democracy. But one of the ways in which, and maybe the central way in which democracy is justified, is by way of an argument of the following sort. And each one of the steps in this argument can be sort of, can be challenged. So not laying this out as sort of like the showstopper of political philosophy. But I am committed to each step in this argument. So, if you don't like where the argument gets us, you got to tell me which of the steps is where, is where I'm making the mistake, or which inference between the steps is flawed. So it seems to me that here's a fundamental, strikes me as correct, fact about morality, right? Very broadly speaking now. Persons have equal moral standing. Now, what that means roughly is something that doesn't mean that everybody is the same, or interchangeable, or everybody is equally deserving. It doesn't mean any of those things, right? It means something much more, I think, morally powerful, but also limited. There is nobody who doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
So, like, nobody. There is no person who is simply of no account, right? That their life makes no difference. Their life doesn't matter. We owe them. There's nobody for whom, just as they are, the rest of us, owe them absolutely nothing. Now, there are all kinds of ways in which, your behavior towards me can determine that I owe you less than I might otherwise have owed you, that I get to treat you in ways that I otherwise wouldn't be able to treat you, right? You slap me in the face, maybe I do get to punch you back, right? So it's not that kind of claim, right? It's that there's something fundamentally different about persons from, let's say, grains of sand or rocks, right? Where, like, maybe unless there's some special, like, maybe unless the rock is Mount Rushmore or something, right? Or the Rosetta Stone, right? Rocks don't matter. At least their mattering is contingent on something. Humans matter. Maybe more than humans matter too, right? Maybe border collies matter, right? Maybe. But humans matter equally. So I think now, again, this is a more controversial premise than it might sound to people who like the ring of it, right? Think about the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, right? Now, I'm not expecting either of you to have read a lot of Aristotle. Maybe you did. That's good for you, right? Or people who are watching this might not have read Aristotle. But one of the things that Aristotle sort of defends very early in his political writings, as if it were just commonplace, is that human beings are not of equal, fundamental equal moral standing. Aristotle famously thought, men matter more than women, right? Famously thought that. Aristotle also, in case you're not aware of this, defends the institution of slavery because he thinks nature makes certain persons naturally subordinate to other persons. Now, it's not the kind of slavery that was practiced, in my country up until 1865 and a little bit thereafter, right? But it is this idea that some people are naturally the bosses of others. Some people are naturally the subordinates of others, the toadies, the lackeys of others. And Aristotle's got a view that says, well, when you get the naturally superior people in charge of the naturally subordinate, that's what a just social order is all about, right? This is why Aristotle winds up being an aristocrat, right? Where the Greek word aristes doesn't mean the rich, it means the best, right? You get the best people to rule over the people who aren't the best. That's what justice is all about, he seems to think. Now, I take it that I'm not the only one in this conversation from that rings a little bit odd.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's that oddness is the fundamental moral premise that democracy is rooted in, right? That's just the idea that, well, wait a minute. People might live their lives in relations of subordination to others. And when those relations are non-voluntary, inescapable, the product of sort of powers that people aren't able to resist, that's unjust, right? Right. So the relationship between just sort of say like the conductor of an orchestra and the violinist might be a relation of superior and subordinate. One person makes the rules, the other person follows them. But that's not exactly the kind of inequality that we're concerned about. We're concerned about the kind of inequality that looks like it's non-voluntary and inescapable, right? Democracy is fundamentally embraces the moral premise that hierarchies of that kind, non-voluntary, inescapable, are fundamentally unjust when it comes to politics at the very least, because humans don't come into the world arranged in a hierarchy. They come into the world each a moral subject equal in value to every other moral subject. So I'm committed to that. We can argue, that's one place where people challenge, but I'm committed to that. Now, here's the other sort of step in the argument in favor of democracy that winds up, you already see, like the first premise is already a premise that is, anti-monarchy, right? Where, there are people in the world, some of whom, aren't far away from, some of whom aren't far away, who still have the vestige of the idea that some people are born into a bloodline that makes them fit to rule, that makes them royal, right? The King of England, right, is king because of his bloodline. Now, let's just be clear, it's like he's not a king in the sense that there were kings, medieval, but there is still that sense that there's some people who are special. Democracy is fundamentally the idea that there's nobody who's special in that way, just because of like who their parents were or what's in their blood, right? Okay, now here's the second move. In order for there to be people living together in proximity at all, there has to be a social order that doesn't merely sort of arise out of their attempts to live together. There has to be a social order that itself reflects and respects their fundamental moral equality. So there has to be politics, right? There has to be processes for making, enforcing, evaluating, changing the rules by which, the terms under which we live together. Now, one upshot of our equality is that we're not to be forced to defer to anybody on the questions of how should we live together, right? The idea that you have to do as I say because I'm me and you're you and I've got a PhD and I assume you don't have a PhD, or I've got a PhD and you don't, right? I'm left-handed and you're not. The idea that you owe me deference because I matter more. Like that's, once we accept basic moral equality, we think, well, each person gets to make up his own mind about how we ought to get on together. That means we're going to disagree about how we ought to get on together, right? So built into the idea of this fundamental equality is two ideas. We need politics, so we need government, and it's a feature, not a bug of our equality, that we are going to disagree about the way in which our politics should be ordered. Not agree, all the way down. I mean, not disagree all the way down, but disagree about, right? What the speed limits should be on the roads that we're going to build, right? And who should protect us from poisoned food, and what should the rules be about people who want to join the society and live together with us? And what should we do when people seem unwilling to follow the rules? I mean, like, we're going to disagree about all kinds of questions about what government should be doing. Now, I think you can see how we're about to get to democracy, right? So we've got fundamental moral equality. That means that we're going to need politics. That means that we're going to need a way of designing our politics in a way that reflects our fundamental equality and recognizes that an upshot of our fundamental equality is that we're going to disagree over politics. So how are we going to make our collective decisions about the terms under which we live? Well, we're going to need some guardrails. Maybe these are sort of like the kinds of Bill of Rights stuff in my country, right? People get to say what they think. People get to print what they think, right? The government doesn't get to come in and just take over your house, right? And we can go through if somebody's looking to put you in a cage and keep you there for a certain number of years, The burden's on them to prove that you broke a rule, not on you to prove that you didn't, right? You can go through sort of the fundamental, like Bill of Rights kinds of stuff in the U.S. Constitution, and you could look for similar things in Australia and all the rest, right? Where you've got guardrails, right? Which are ways of respecting that fundamental equality. Then we've got constitutional structures that assign jobs to various government agents, and ultimately a set of rules for electing people to make the decisions under conditions where, even once elected, they can be held accountable by the people. And that's all fundamentally sort of a design for striving for a political order that treats us as equals. Because here's the last part of this, and see what you think of this. Now, unsolicited bit of autobiography from the guy you happen to have invited on your show. I think that political philosophy, when we're asking a question like democracy or, and then we fill in the blank, like I think the only other actual contender is anarchism.
Okay.
Because I think anarchism is anarchism understood as a philosophical view. Anarchism is the philosophical view that no political state is legitimate. Anarchists don't have to be smash the state kinds of terrorists. Mm-hmm. Anarchists can just say, well, anarchism is just the view that the state's a bully. There's no difference between, the government of the United States and Tony Soprano. There's just a guy who has the biggest stick. And if you don't do what he says, he beats you up. That's just what, that's what governments are. Governments are not the kinds of things that you owe loyalty to or allegiance to. Patriotism is a lie. Anarchism can say all that stuff. They don't have to, they can admit we're stuck with the world of governments. They don't have to say we have to dissolve all government. They can say, governments are evil, but it's where we're at, so we got to figure out a way to keep them in check. I mean, so anarchism is a subtle kind of view, at least as I'm understanding it. But the thing that the anarchist and the Democrat, now understood as the philosophical defender of democracy, not as the sort of Barack Obama Democrat. I don't mean like that. I'm not the party, but a believer in democracy. Only anarchism and democracy agree with what seems to me to be correct. And I think that all other proposed forms of government don't even acknowledge the question that both the anarchist and the Democrat acknowledge, which is this: political power ought to be hard to justify. Right? It ought to be difficult to justify political power. Now, if you're thinking, as your question way back before you, right, about, well, what about dictatorship, various kinds of authoritarianisms, various kinds of communist structures, depending on what you mean by communism, we're thinking about it as a form of government, right? Or
yeah.
Go back, right, to, not merely Stalin, but, to Lenin and even in some moods Trotsky. Communism is the dictatorship of the proletariat. Right? It's a dictatorship. The fundamental premise of all of these anti-democratic forms of politics, besides anarchism, is that justifying political power is simple. You got the right stuff in your blood, you get to boss other people around. Right? You're at the vanguard of the working class, you get to boss everybody else around. The anarchist and the Democrat are the only two options in political philosophy, it seems to me, that take very seriously the thought that it ought to be hard to justify arrangements whereby some people call the shots for other people. The anarchist says there is no mode of politics that involves government that can satisfy the requirement to justify political power. democracy is the only other option, because democracy says, hold on, I'm asking the same kind of question as you, Mr. Anarchist. I've got an answer, though. When political power is directed by processes that treat the people who are subject to that power as equals, gives the people who are subject to that power an equal say, and is constrained by a set of concerns for the equal rights of the people who are subject to that power, then political power can be justified. So that's where I think that's the choice space we're in, right? Philosophical anarchism or philosophical democracy. And it strikes me that, for reasons we'll go into next if you want, it strikes me that given that choice, democracy is superior to anarchism. But I think all of the anti-democratic options that you could list, benevolent kingship, how benevolent will he stay, right? Dictatorship of the proletariat, various kinds of aristocratic and oligarchic. Like, well, what if you get the right oligarchs, right? I think, that puts somebody in control of everybody else in a way that I think it fundamentally disrespects their equality. I think that either democracy can be made to work as a philosophical proposition, or the anarchist wins and politics is always merely just different kinds of oppression. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. You get, man, yeah. That was a full course meal right there. I love that. No, that was great.
That's why they pay me the big bucks. Yeah.
I'm brimming with questions. I'm gonna ask two that come to mind right now that I'd like to ask before passing it back to Nishant. Is there a nation outside of the U.S. that you think handles democracy better than us?
Yeah. No, look, I mean, so the answer is yes.
And I would like to know which one.
Iceland.
Oh, okay. All right.
You know anything about Iceland?
Not much.
Okay. In 2010, by the way, the country went through this amazing process of revising its constitution that I'll describe for you in a minute. It wound up being undermined at the very end. So this is like a story of like real commitment to democracy that winds up sort of falling apart at the very end, because democracy is hard. In 2010, the country of Iceland sought to revise its constitution. And the way it did it was by way of a series of very elaborate processes of consulting all of the citizens, everyone in the world with Icelandic citizenship, not merely the Icelanders who lived in Iceland. Part of that process involved putting up on a wiki the current Icelandic constitution and giving citizens access to edit it. Alongside a series of deliberative, sort of like episodes where small segments, randomly chosen segments of the population got together to talk about particular policy options with respect to environmental rules and all the rest. And they wound up with this sort of like amazingly inclusive, very agile process, drawing up an entirely new constitution for the country that eventually, through a kind of procedural wrinkle, couldn't be ratified. Long story there. And roughly since they completed this process, that country has been trying to figure out how to get it back on track, how to get the constitution that was originally the product of this long deliberative process ratified. And they're struggling to figure it out. But that was a real exercise in democracy. Now, look, there are all kinds of things, Rana, one can say about this, right? Like, well, it's a small country, like half the country lives in the capital city of Reykjavik, right? So we're talking about small, we're talking about from the point of view of ethnic and linguistic diversity. It's a very homogeneous society. We could talk about all of these things, but if you look at larger countries, so for example, in Paris, in France, there was the Citizens Assembly about climate change a couple of years ago, where they did something similar. Randomly selected small groups of French citizens got together. They learned together about climate policy, climate change, climate science, and together made a recommendation for for Paris's for France's policy on climate change. So there are countries that do democracy better. But let me say one sort of more philosophical thing, right?
Man, I think I'm gonna have to get my weight down. I'm gonna have to start running again. I'm gonna have to get my fitness back up and get my health right, because I want to make sure that my monthly premium is low when I start paying for this life insurance policy. Go ahead and get yourself a life insurance policy on iCoverDirect.com. You can get one in as quick as 5 minutes. No medical exams, no agents' involvement at all. Just you, a stable internet connection, your phone or your laptop, a few questions, a little bit of your time, like I said. And yeah, at least see how much it's going to cost you. I mean, you'll be in disbelief, I promise you. Back to the show.
Now, the reason why when I, early when I first said democracy is the aspiration or the ideal, right? The striving for creating a country, creating a society of self-governing equals. Part of what is built into the idea of democracy being an ideal or an aspiration is that no society fully embodies or manifests, right, that ideal. No society, I think, not even Iceland, is a self-governing society of equals. I think that what makes democratic societies democratic is that their institutions, their politics, their political practices reflect the project of trying to get closer to being a society of self-governing equals. If that sounds weird to you, right, that we're defining a particular kind of politics in virtue of some ideal to be strived for, right? Let me ask a different kind of question. Is Taylor Swift an artist?
I would say so.
Yeah.
Really? She's not anywhere near as good a songwriter as, Dolly Parton.
I'm not that well versed in either individual to be able to respond to that, but I'll take it.
She's not as good a singer as Maria Callas, the opera singer. She's not Eddie Van Halen on the guitar. In what sense is she an artist? She's not Vincent van Gogh, right?
She's not Vincent van Gogh.
Is she Beethoven?
She's not Beethoven.
Okay.
She's Taylor Swift.
All right, good. Is she Laurence Olivier or Robert De Niro?
She's not
Meryl Streep.
No.
No. Okay. So she's not an exemplary singer. Let's grant me the following. I mean, I hope you don't have Swifties like in your audience, right?
I hope not.
Well, hold on. But if you are a Swiftie listening to this, wait till I get to the end. It's going to be okay. Trust me. Right? Say, look, all kinds of ways in which we can say she falls short of being exemplary, excellent, the best at playing guitar, singing, and writing songs. There are people who are better than her, right? There are ways in which she could be better, right? But I say, look, despite the fact that she falls short when compared to Beethoven at composing music, for example, that doesn't mean she's not an artist. What makes her an artist is the aspiration, right? Is that, let's just assume this is true, and I happen to have reason to think this is true, right?
Yes.
Taylor Swift lives her life working at improving as a songwriter, as a singer, as a musician, as a composer, right? Her life is directed toward, this is why the Swifties are going to be okay, right? Her life is directed towards perfecting her craft. That's what makes her an artist, right?
Yes.
Let me give a slightly less controversial among some of your audience members, perhaps, example. So going back to this ancient Greek, Aristotle. Aristotle thought that the stars were fixed, that the planets don't move. Aristotle had no understanding of DNA. Aristotle never looked through a telescope or a microscope. He had no concept of the germ or bacteria. Aristotle thought snakes have no genitals because their genitals rub off on the ground as they move. Aristotle believed that human women have 4 fewer teeth than human men. Aristotle didn't believe the theory of evolution because there wasn't one. Right? Aristotle believed species were eternal and not the products of natural selection and mutable. Was Aristotle a scientist? The answer to that is yes.
Oh.
By the way, here's just a fact about Aristotle you might not know, right? Aristotle's the first guy to conduct dissections. Aristotle has major works on biology, right?
Wow.
Where Aristotle spends, we might want to say it's bad science, right? Because he doesn't have the microscope. He doesn't have a laboratory. He doesn't have litmus paper, right? It's primitive science, right? And you might say his conclusions, like if a guy, I'm pointing at the building across the way where the biologists live on campus, right? So I'm here gesturing towards Wilson Hall on Vanderbilt, which is where the biology department is. Somebody said to me, well, there's a biology professor who doesn't believe the theory of evolution, has never heard of DNA, has never looked through a microscope, and believes all of these weird things about animals and their anatomy and all the rest. I'd be like, that guy should be fired. You can't be a scientist if you don't believe those things, right? Aristotle didn't believe those things. Why is he a scientist? Because he engaged in a kind of natural inquiry, into the natural world, using observation, forming hypotheses, testing them, revising them. He came up with, really primitive, now we would say barely scientific results. Nobody is an Aristotelian about biology. Nobody's an Aristotelian in science, right? But we say, look, what makes him a scientist is not the conclusions. It's the aspiration to understand and query and investigate in a particularly ordered way. That's what makes him a scientist. He's given us bad science, but that doesn't mean he's not a scientist. In the same way, we might say, Taylor Swift has not given us, right, the Fifth Symphony from as Beethoven did. But she's an artist because of how her life is conducted, what it aspires to. Aristotle gave us this whacked out view of the natural world. Scientist, though, because of how he sought to try to come to understand things. Now, I think democracy as a term works in that same way, right? A society is democratic given what it aspires to, what aspirations are built into what it's doing right now. So, to go back to the question, I think there are countries in the world that show a far deeper investment in becoming more authentically democratic than the United States. Does that sound all right?
Yes,
Yeah.
it does.
Yeah.
Love it. My second question was, is there any nation that rules with anarchy or anarchism?
Well, there wouldn't be a nation.
Okay.
because there'll be
Yeah, so there wouldn't be a government.
Or I
Right?
guess, yeah. Is there any I guess society or group of people that, however big or small of a place, where they abide by that structure?
Well, certainly the history of human societies are riddled with experiments in living together without government. Right? Now you can imagine certain kind of small you could tell a story about certain kinds of tribal societies, certain kinds of nomadic societies where there's no centralized, governing body. But anywhere where you've got a group of people making decisions that govern them all, to which they're all bound by, where the decision-making rule is unanimity. Like, so if you're ever out with your friends and you're deciding what restaurant to go to or what movie to see, and if everybody has veto power, that's what anarchism is. Right? We're all living according to a rule, but none of us is living according to any rules that we don't ourselves endorse. Now, again, I think that the more plausible forms of anarchism are the forms that roughly hold what I characterized it as earlier. Yeah, you've got governments. They're here to stay. Part of what governments try to do is to convince you that they're not just bullies, that they are things you should pledge your allegiance to, you should fight for, you should sacrifice for, right? What governments, democratic or otherwise, all have in common. Here's the anarchist side. Like I wake up every couple of days and think that, I think anarchism really is correct, right? So that's the autobiography part of this. Like, I vacillate between being like a real defender of democracy and sort of like being like, I think I'm an anarchist today, right? Philosophically speaking, right? This is one of the privileges of my work as a political philosopher and a professor, is that I get to wake up in the morning and think that maybe I need to change all of my beliefs about stuff, right? Here's what all states, democratic or otherwise, try to do. They try to convince you that they're not simply bullies, that you owe them allegiance, right? That they secure your freedom, right? That they make you special, right? Now think about your favorite Scorsese mob boss character, or as I mentioned earlier, Tony Soprano from the show The Sopranos. Now he does a little of that. I protect you, I provide for you, right? But we all know that when Tony Soprano says it, that's part of his way of being threatening. Right? That's him very subtly and indirectly reminding you that he can have your legs broken by the end of the day.
Yeah.
Right? Now, the anarchist says, yes, states are just like that. You don't owe them allegiance. They just tell you owe them allegiance. Have you ever been, maybe both of you have been, I think this is pretty true across the board, but certainly it's true in the United States. If you ever been to a government building,
Yeah.
any government building, the local state house, the court in your local district, they all architecturally have common features. One thing that government buildings around the world, but certainly around the United States and a lot of the other countries I've been to, one of the architectural features that all government buildings have in common is really high ceilings. You step into a government building and the ceiling is way up there. Why? Because it's part of government's job to make you feel small and powerless. right? That's what government does, is it tries to get in your head. This is the anarchist speaking now. Government of any kind, government tries to get in your head and make you subservient. Make you feel powerless before its authority. So, you know, again, the Democrat and this is why, like, I live this double life inside my head, right? The anarchist and the Democrat are like, those are the two options, right?
Mm.
I think anarchism is best understood not as we have to live without states. I think that the anarchist is doing a good job when he or she says, look, we're stuck with states. What we don't have to be stuck with is the mindset that the state is very invested in creating in us that we belong to the state, that the state's necessary, that the state is an object of our admiration, that we ought to identify with it, right? The state is really just a really good captor. The state is holding us hostage, and it's a master at invoking in us Stockholm syndrome. It gets us right. Think about in the United States, right? During a very, very formative time of your life in the United States and in lots of other places, right? The state comes in, knocks on the door of your household, and tells your parents, we see you've got a 6-year-old child. Well, until that child is about 16, they're going to spend, about 7 hours a day with us. You don't like that? Too bad. Your kid's coming to school. You don't like that? You've got some options. They're costly. You can homeschool if you can afford that. We'll let you do that, but we still get to monitor that, right? And maybe at the beginning of every day of those, 16, 15, 10 years, whatever it is, at the beginning of every day, we're going to make them stand up, put their hand on their heart, and recite a poem about how great the state is. And they're going to make up, despite the fact that they're only 9 years old and can't really make a binding pledge, they're going to pledge allegiance to the flag that represents us. You can't do anything about that. We're going to make them say that they love us again and again and again. Right? Say, like, whoa. Now, imagine. Last point that I could drop my anarchist persona, if you like. I mean,
We love it. Yeah.
Again, like, imagine waking up and discovering you've got a new neighbor across the street who walks around in a very funny looking costume. And he tells you that he's making these costumes for other people on the block. And if other people on the block are really good at doing what he says, he's going to give them a little new pin to put on the costume. And don't worry, he says. I'm just making sure that, people who are bad, don't get away with being bad. And then he opens his garage door and you see that he's building person-sized cages that he's going to keep the bad people in the neighborhood in. So if I catch somebody doing something bad, me and the guys with these uniforms, we're going to force them to stop, and then I'm going to make them live in my garage in these cages. But don't worry, it's only the bad people going there. And this is all for your benefit. And because it's all for your benefit, you got to help me fund it. So a certain amount of your money has got to come to me. And if you don't want to pay that money to me, there's a cage for you too. Right? Oh, and by the way, I've also gotten this stockpile of very, very violent weapons that's going to help me. keep the neighborhood safe, just how I like it. Like, just imagine you had a neighbor who did all of these things, asked you for its money, asked you for money, and then you discover, just to add to the crazy, right? And then you discover he also like pays people to write songs about how great he is. And on certain days of the year, at certain occasions, he expects people to put their hands on their heart and sing those songs about how great he is. Just imagine another human being doing the things that states routinely do. Right? You would have a certain psychological diagnosis of a person who was doing this. Psychopathic might be the word that comes to mind. Right? That's, the anarchist says, that's what states are. They're psychopaths. They're psychopathic agents that are interested in controlling others, while trying to convince the people that they're controlling that it's all for their own good, it's necessary, they need the protection. The sooner we come to see that that's what every state is, the anarchist says, the better, right? The anarchist is like an abusive spouse. Seeing that is really crucial, right, to maintaining your dignity, is the anarchist view. Now, once you see anarchism as simply that proposition, right, all states are abusers. It's like, okay, no state really has the authority. They just have they're like, Tony Soprano is not entitled to your tribute to him. He just has the power to get you to pay it. The state tells you, I have the power to get you to pay your taxes because I'm entitled to your money. The anarchist says, it's just Tony Soprano. That all the way down, it's just Tony Soprano. So there are no there aren't, like maybe Christiana in Denmark. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Right, that section of Copenhagen that is a autonomous, self-governing commune. Do you know Christiana? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I'm gonna have to research this because I'm very intrigued with what you're about to tell me.
So, Christiana is a little district in Copenhagen that is run like an anarchist community.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's
small. It's small. It's hard to the one rule they have for people on the outside: you can't take photos. If they don't want it to become like a touristy kind of thing. You can go there. There are restaurants there, and they're like, you can like eat there. Like they're just an autonomous little district in Copenhagen that's run like an anarchist community. Nothing gets to be a rule unless everybody agrees.
Wow.
Okay, sorry. I'm giving longer answers than.
No.
We love it.
Okay.
This is amazing.
Are you like? What's your like? Are you in favor of capitalism?
A lot depends on what one means, but
Okay.
if you think of
Are you in favor of a capitalistic society?
again, a lot turns on what one means.
Okay.
So and by the way, so let me put it this way. I'm not committed to the idea that societies that distribute goods and services by way of market interactions are fundamentally unjust. So if you think that capitalism simply is the commitment to the idea that market interactions are going to be these mechanisms for distributing goods and services, then I've got no problem with capitalism. I think that markets are sort of inescapable, unavoidable as the mechanisms by which we distribute, goods and services, and also benefits and burdens, right? So if you mean by a capitalist society, where there's a free market that does distributive stuff, then yes, I'm a capitalist. However, I'm also like, I'm a democratic socialist. I think there should be market mechanisms, but with a really generous, a real generous safety net. I think that the free market can't do as much justifying of conditions of the kind of economic inequality in my country that seems to be not only prevailing but expanding. I don't think that the free market justifications of those conditions are satisfactory. That is, I think that disparities of the kind that are that prevail in the United States and elsewhere in sort of material resources are unjust. And a society that has the material capability to design institutions that alleviate or significantly decrease those inequalities and decides nonetheless not to make those adjustments, I think is an unjust, is doing something seriously unjust.
What's an ideal society for you?
An ideal society for me would be a functioning democracy where access to the activities of citizenship that are necessary for the democracy's authenticity and success are that access is not blocked by, not only not blocked, but is actually enabled by a fair distribution of material resources. So I don't think that the injustice of vast economic inequalities has to do with haves and have-nots stuff, that some people have so much more than other people. I mean, that might be bad. I don't know that that's unjust. What I think is unjust is that material inequality is directly contributes to inaccessibility to democratic channels to improve the economic conditions under which one is living. So the fact that there are billionaires as such doesn't strike me as a problem. It might be, from justice's point of view, it might be bad for other kinds of reasons. It might just be bad that there are people who hoard resources like that. I don't know. I don't know that it's unjust. Where I think the injustice lies is that sort of ordinary activities that should be equally freely accessible in a democracy to all citizens are in effect obstructed due to material inequalities.
Is there a parallel between anarchism and atheism?
I mean, depending on what you mean by parallel, I don't think that there's anything like a logical connection, right? That I don't think that embracing one requires the other, right?
Right.
I think you can be a religious believer and an anarchist.
Hi again. I know you're pissed off looking at me or Rana or both of us trying to sell life insurance or just trying to sell iCover direct to you. But let me be honest. It's the best thing you can do in 2026. Get a life insurance policy for your loved ones right now. Protect their future for any mishaps in the future. You have no idea, right? Life is unexpected. So go to iCoverdirect.com, answer a few medical questions, answer a few personal questions, and you'll have a life insurance policy in just 5 minutes. You don't have to give any medical exams. You can ignore all the documents, all the paperwork, everything, and no agents, right? Just you, your phone, and your loved ones. And back to the show.
Right. Not that they're codependent in that way, but
Right.
I guess in the idea that
Sure.
that morals don't have to be set or decided for you, that you can kind of come about an idea of how to live on your own without some sort of overarching structure of sorts, right? In that sense, would you say that there's a parallel there?
So yeah, I mean, and they're historically aligned in various ways. I mean, just think of anarchist movements, no gods, no masters, And if you think that in the history of anarchist thinking, where anarchism, has some roots in sort of anti-monarchy kinds of political movements, where the monarch, the czar, the king, was claimed to have their authority to rule over others by way of divine appointment, right? So you could see that somebody who's saying, you're not the boss of me, nobody's the boss of me, you could see how that would, that could be very easily tied into a certain atheist positions. But no, atheists tend to be sort of in the business of denying denying supernatural creator entities of almost any kind, right? So you can see that the anarchism might be tied to the idea that God's not my master either, but atheism is also the view that there aren't gods, that you can imagine a God that created everything and then just doesn't give anybody any directions, right? Atheists are opposed to that too. So atheism is just the denial of atheism is the denial of the existence of a certain type of creature, where that type is not necessarily the kind of creature that gives you commandments, right? Instructions on how to live. Atheists oppose, sort of deistic conceptions of God as well, where God builds universes. That's just the kind of guy he is. And then lets them play out, right? Like a kid spinning a top and then spinning another top, and sets the top in motion and then goes on and spins another one, and isn't invested in what goes on. That's sort of the theological view that was pretty popular among the founding fathers of the United States, by the way, right? That God just makes stuff and makes us in a particular way, but doesn't task us with loving one another or give us commandments. That's all up to us. Atheists are opposed to that too. So you could see that the move from being an anarchist to being opposed to certain conceptions, certain kinds of theological entities, is a much, right, a God that gives you commandments, that simply in virtue of the fact that he can punish you and that he did you the favor of making you, he gets to give you rules, right? You can see anarchism is allied with rejecting that. Might not be allied with a broader sense of atheism that just rejects supernatural creator entities as such. Does that help?
Yeah, that does help. That does help, certainly. That does help. And because that was one thing that, and again, we're gonna have to have a part two to this conversation, just because there's, again, I know we're running short on time now, but matter of fact, I'll save I had one more question, but I'll go ahead and save that for then. But that does make sense, and Nishant was able to join us briefly here again, but he's still having network issues, it seems like. So I'll go ahead and close this out. Wow, to know that you are in a state that's not too far away, right? You're
in St. Louis, is that right?
St. Louis, Missouri. Yep.
Just drive away.
Drive away. That's right. So to know that, it's really cool to know that. And I'm just so privileged and happy. I'll speak for both of us. We're both so privileged and happy and honored to have been able to have this exchange and this conversation with you. So thank you so much. We really do appreciate it. And
this is what I do.
Yeah, no. Truly, but just to give us your time like this and give us the amount of the rich input and information that you gave us, it's just something that will sit with us now until our next exchange, certainly. So thank you again, and we hope that you have a good rest of your day, good rest of your week. And for everyone that's watching this, please, where could they find you? Where could they? Is there anything that you'd want them to follow or buy or anything? You know, this is, you want to plug anything?
I I'm an old man, as you can see, so I still call it Twitter. I have a Twitter account that's not very philosophical. It's just it's probably half of me playing 1 minute guitar clips of punk rock songs.
Oh wow! And what is that? Is that at
Robert Talisse? Yeah.
That's awesome. That's really cool. And I'd love to delve more into that next time. So certainly. So that's where you can find him at, and they could buy your books too, right? I think yeah. And
probably download them for free somewhere on the web. I'm not sure where. But
yeah, no, I think your Wikipedia has some of those aggregated, so people can kind of go from there.
You can search on whatever your online book provider is.
Yeah, all right.
And there are lots of options.
All right, y'all. If you like this episode, please like, comment, subscribe, share, follow, any and all of which, the good stuff just to help us grow, so we can help and bring more conversations like this to you. And we do appreciate this time that you've given us, Doctor. Thank you so much. Take care.
Take care. See you guys later. Have a good day, all right?
Yes.